Hello, everyone. Welcome to Opinions New by Dr. Frank T. and Shay. I'm Frank. Okay. In this episode, I want to talk about the topic of a Chinese communist attack on U.S. satellites. Okay. Well, we know that SpaceX is going to tomorrow, May 27th, launch first time, by a commercial spacecraft to the National Space Station. And on the other hand, the U.S. the X-37B, another military spacecraft, is being tested. Okay? And also, we have seen the Chinese Communist regime has become more and more desperate as China faces more and more severe economic challenges to its society and its economy. And while the Chinese economy and society are on the collapse, on the brink of a collapse, many strategists believe that the China or Chinese Communist regime could launch something, something drastic, do something drastic to save themselves, to save their own life and their own power. Right? And from a historical perspective, the Chinese Communist government has been doing something like that, quite several times. When their governance is in crisis, they will use territory, sovereignty, or national security as excuse to launch all kinds of military adventures, to stir up some conflicts, and to shift people's attention, focus, and use extreme patriotism, to gather people's support from the Chinese people. That's something quite capable, quite possible to be used by the Chinese regime. We have seen that the Chinese government have used this, you can say, strategy during the Korean War. The China-India border war in 1962, and the China-Russian war between over a small island in the northern boundary, and also China and the Vietnam War in the South China Sea in 1970s, and also China-Vietnam border war in the 1970s. Okay? All of those wars that China started, you can see that they cost a lot, cost dearly the Chinese economy, but the strategic goals were quite murky. It's unclear. And also, they didn't really win too much on territories or sovereignty, but only enabled the Chinese regime to stay stable, or stay in power for more time. Okay? And the current situation, we have seen that the Chinese government has spent more on military side technology and on their nuclear forces, and modernize their navy forces. They are even trying to conduct some nuclear tests, and that's why the U.S. government wants to include China in its talk with Russia on nuclear treaty, but China refuses. Right? Normally, people would think that the China's enemies or China's strategic enemies could be or are the Vietnam and the Philippines in the South China Sea, and Taiwan and in Japan. Right? But the strategists from China and U.S. all believe the true enemy or true strategic target of Chinese government is not those countries surrounding China, but the United States. Okay? I think both China and U.S. governments know clearly that even though the U.S. may not, actively seek a war with China or try to remove the Chinese Communist Party, but I believe the U.S. Is willing to see the collapse of Chinese Communist Party over the Wuhan pandemic and the economic, wars, after that, since then, also the war between U.S. China on scientific, intellectual properties, ideologies, and we can see that more and more American government officials, high-ranking officials, realize it's actually the Chinese Communist regime that's causing all the troubles between the two countries. Right? It's the regime that caused all the troubles we have. Right? In the past, the U.S. government has not been very active in seeking or standing up against Chinese communists. One reason now we know is because of economic ties, economic interests. The two economies, U.S. China, have kind of like immersed into each other too much, intertwined with each other. And there's a word called China America, and therefore it's hard for those people, for those who have a vested interest in that, to break away from China. And second, a lot of many times the U.S. government under the certain administrations fail to shoulder the responsibility of the world police. Right? And also in the past, also the U.S. needs China's cooperation in dealing with North Korea and Iran on their nuclear issues. So, but I believe that the U.S. should be glad to see a collapse of Chinese communists, because once the Chinese communists is gone, and China will become a free and democratic society, and then the potential threat from China on U.S. could be eliminated, right? And then once the China threat disappears, and Russia will lose a partner in fighting the United States, and Russia will not become too much of a pressure too much of a threat to the U.S. without the financial economic support of China, right? And then without the support of Russia and China, the Islamic extremists in the Middle East could not sustain it much longer. Therefore, we could see our new global structure and the enduring peace, and they all become possible. So, of course, we know that the Chinese communist regime is not just sitting there in idling, waiting to be eliminated, right? And they'll try everything, try hard to fight, right? Especially nowadays with the pandemic going into the disappearance, and the countries and the groups, lawsuits, and are going after China for retribution, right? For the damage, right? And also the Chinese armies, PLAs, under control of this descendants of the first, they call the second red generation second generation of reds, that the sons and daughters of the first generation of Chinese communist leaders, they're in control of the militaries. They have been brainwashing the Chinese soldiers about American threat. And of course, China may now want to challenge America in where they see America is the strongest. But in the final act, if the regime sees that the whole government or control is collapsing, what could they be, in their final strike or final attempt to attack America, just to make them stay last a little longer. I think that possibility is real. But now under current competitive environment or the military confrontations, there's a symmetry between U.S. and Chinese military power, military capabilities, and into the information age and the age of space warfare. What will be the weak spot of U.S. military? The Chinese military has been working hard to find asymmetrical warfare, right? They find something that they could use and with low cost to lead American to suffer the most, okay? So as to actually to neutralize or to diminish the Chinese disadvantage in the military technology. One way, in my opinion, is their active or voluntary attack on U.S. satellite system. Okay, that's because from communication control, intelligence, the C4I, and also to the military, U.S. military, the precision guided bombs, the delivery of our military forces, the war on internet, the cyberspace, the information warfare. The U.S. depends on the satellite systems, our whole satellite system. There's huge satellite systems, including reconnaissance, observation, communication, espionage. The whole system is now well protected, and China knows that. And this system could be jeopardized and compromised by anti-satellite, missiles. And China has tested that several times, many times. And the technology is relatively easy, actually. And any country that can deliver or send a rocket to space and has the capability to hit the satellite that's basically fixed, in position in space. So it's also very economical, right? You can use cost you very little to destroy something, huge assets of their enemy country. So once the U.S. superiority in space is eliminated, if it's eliminated, and then it may make Chinese military look a little more stronger, right? So would that be the question is, will China attack U.S. military satellites or U.S. satellites? Okay? I think the possibility is real, okay? And could take place, and it could be a Pearl Harbor of 21st century. Okay? If Chinese communists knows that they're going to collapse economically and collapse politically, and the Chinese society collapses, and there's nothing they have left, and they too could go to the this route and give their final blow, final strike, just like a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Think about that. The Japanese, the military leaders, the political leaders, many of them knew that they shouldn't do that. They could not prevail with that, but they had to do. Once they did it, they knew, failure or disaster will come over their head. For the Japanese, if they don't attack U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, right? And the Pacific Fleet of U.S. will block the Strait of Malacca, and cut off the energy supply of Japan. And China, in addition, U.S. Already refused to sell scrap metals to Japan. So Japan was on the brink of losing its power to wage a war and to a total destruction. In doing that, of course, America would fight back with revenge. There are more years of time to breathe. If we compare the U.S. and China relationship versus that of the Japanese-U.S. relationship, you find quite some similarities here, right? The Pearl Harbor of 21st century is not in Hawaii, it's not on the sea, but in the sky. It is a global system, our global positioning system, GPS, communication satellites, and surveillance satellites. and surveillance satellites. A lot of work to fight against that. Okay? And once a new version of Pearl Harbor attack indeed takes, and once it happens, China starts to attack U.S. satellites, at least those over China. U.S. starts to attack, remove Chinese satellites, and then it's a matter of who is best, who is the fastest in relaunch new satellites to restore the communication and surveillance and guidance and space guidance. Right? Who has the better ability to prevent the others from restoring their satellites? Okay? Obviously, the U.S. has an advantage. We have seen that the spacecraft, even Google and Facebook, they all trying hard to launch satellites, launch rockets, and there's really private enterprise, whole private enterprise, a sea of private satellites, a system in place in addition to U.S. government capabilities. So that makes it harder for the Chinese to attack. But in a nutshell, I believe the threat of a Chinese attack on U.S. satellite is still possible, even though they know they don't have the advantage. But out of desperation, that's still something they could do.